Hello and welcome to another week of Women Gender Studies 1000. This week we're going to be talking about binary systems of categorization, and then specifically dive into sex and gender, and really pick apart those two binaries. So we start talking about the concept of binaries, why they get used, why they tend to be problematic when we're looking at people. Uh, Dive more into gender and sex. So what do we mean when we say each of those words? How are they different from each other? And how do we talk about them and when do we talk about them? We're going to talk about trans and non-binary identities in particular. All right, so starting off with binaries and the problems with binary categorization. Um, and so this is a really great piece that if this intrigues you or you want to think more deeply about this, that's linked in all of these slides that mention it. And often when I do a reading, I'll pull quotes and change them a little bit, shorten them, but these were all kind of so perfect I decided to kind of just keep them as is. So Stein says, what do I mean by binary thinking? The primary example is the tendency to split all the things into just two simple categories, black and white, either or, right and wrong. And this actually aligns with when we talk about student development theory. We often talk about the transitions that we see in students away from black and white thinking, that 17, 18, 19-year-olds, especially, though not exclusively, tend to be rooted in black and white thinking in a lot of areas of their life, that they're a good or bad student, that there's no gray in between, that something goes wrong, that they're failing, even if it's totally surmountable. And in terms of how they look at people. So Stein goes on to say, I could say, and this is to demonstrate an example of attempting to establish a binary. So he says, I could say there are two types of people in this world, people who split people into two groups and people that don't, which is a bit ridiculous because it's something we all do to some extent. Do I mean group A does this usually and group B does this rarely, always versus never? Am I splitting these groups by the mean or the median? Or is it so generalized that I could mean something completely different every time I say it? And that's starting to get to the root of this problem with binaries, is that when human experience exists in more than two concrete ways, describing it as one or the other of two concrete experiences isn't going to be useful, and it's going to cause overgeneralization. So if you say there are people who like coffee and people who don't like coffee, the group that doesn't like coffee, are you only including people who are repulsed by it? Are you including people who will drink it occasionally but would prefer tea? Are you where are you drawing that line? And that idea of who actually fits into these boxes and what happens when you're outside of them is what we're going to be talking about today. Stein says, binary thinking is a form of generalization. We all know that not everything fits neatly into one of two categories. We understand that we live in a complicated world with 1,000 colors and 1,000,000 sounds. No one would try to paint a rainbow in black and white. Grace doesn't count. That's still more than two shades. So this is saying that we know this to be true in almost every context. People are able to recognize that there are more than two human lived experiences. But when we start to challenge some of these binaries, people get really defensive. So Stein goes on to say there are a lot of pitfalls to binary thinking, one of which is the lack of gradation. I understand that some classes are pass-fail and with good reason. Sometimes that's appropriate. But if I'm seriously learning a craft, starting a career, really putting myself into something, I want to know how I'm doing. There's a big difference between a D plus and an A minus. I want to know how I'm doing. Put me on a percentile and let me decide if I'm living up to my own standards. Another example he gives, putting people on a black-white scale of good, bad is problematic. Pickpocketing is wrong. Taking $5 out of someone's pocket is bad. That's a criminal act that makes you a criminal. Murdering 7 people in cold blood is also bad. It's a criminal act, makes you a criminal. But with only 2 categories, both people are just bad. And common sense dictates those 2 criminals do not belong in the same punitive category by any stretch of the imagination. Right. And so thinking of people as entirely good or as entirely bad, we learn a little relatively early on that that's not necessarily the case, right? We're definitely talking about good people and bad people as little kids, but then your mom will make you angry, and that's a good person that you're told, right? Or you may have a family member who you really love and care about who goes to jail. Oftentimes, when we're taught about, in some religious contexts, when we're taught about LGBTQ plus people, we're taught that they're not bad, but that they're just confused, that they need to like find Jesus, right? That's not as bad as individuals who act upon their homosexuality, right? That we're grading, they talk about the lack of gradation, we're grading experiences. And this crime example is interesting in that it doesn't have a clear endpoint in either direction, right? With this grades example, we kind of know the scale is from an F to an A or an A plus. With something like crime, the ends of that spectrum are not as clear, right? There is no one worst crime. Is in the way that is murdering 8 people worse than 7? Yes. Is disenfranchising an entire population of people worse than murdering a number of them? That's harder to say. How do you count impact, right? That can be really challenging. What's the least bad crime? Is it jaywalking, which most of us would argue is kind of a weird law? There's a purpose for it, right? Is it illegally downloading stuff? There's somebody who still is harmed in that, right? Like, what is the other end of that spectrum? And that's really where more of the spirit that I think I want us to take into thinking about other lived experiences as less binary is not so much to rely on, okay, it's a binary, it's not a binary, therefore it's a spectrum, where there's still a clear end point or a most or a least in some way, when in reality, that's not always the case. I think this crime example is good in that you could imagine criminal penalty for things going off in lots of directions, right? For a less serious crime that harms more people, you may see the punishment go up compared to that same crime on less people. That different types of crimes are punished in different ways. And that I find is a better analogy for what we're talking about here, that we can't necessarily fit these things that aren't binaries into spectrums either. But that I've seen visualizations that are kind of like clouds or clumps, but that actually understanding lived experience is significantly more complicated than a black and white system, also more complicated than some of the tools we've tried to use to address this complexity, like a spectrum. Stein goes on to say, and I this is how he closes out this piece, and I thought this was really important. He says, critical thinking is so important right now. We're going to need more of it if we're going to make a difference. I know that people who need it most are not reading this, but you are, and thank you, by the way. I believe that you want to make a difference, and I believe that you have what it takes to make a difference. This little exercise isn't going to solve any of the world's problems, but if it helps you express yourself or sharpen your focus, maybe it can amplify the difference you're already making. So this is Stein's call for folks to think more critically. He positions critical thinking as kind of the opposite to binary thinking. which he talks about as more automatic, socially conditioned, and easier, simpler. And then he's pairing this idea of critical thinking with this idea of breaking down these social binaries, which I think is really important. By far, the biggest skill that we want you to learn in a college or university setting is critical thinking. We often hear, we as in departments like women and gender studies, we'll often hear the criticism that we are teaching our beliefs where other departments are teaching things that are known. And well, if not true, we just, as we talked about in the last few weeks, we just come to know things in a slightly different way. But that this is really the case, that we're not asking people to abandon critical thinking. I think that tends to be what people claim we are doing in women and gender studies, is ask people to abandon critical thinking and instead to adopt our philosophy as feminists, or as people that believe in feminism, or people that believe in these more complex identity systems rather than binaries. The rest of people to abandon critical thinking and adopt this newer idea, or more progressive idea, however you want to frame it. When in reality, what we are asking people to do is to use their critical thinking skills to look at the world and see what is actually happening, the diversity of experiences that is actually visible, that people can experience through engaging with other people in real life, on the internet, through media, all of that. And to use your critical thinking skills to say, is what I'm seeing true? Is what is happening true? Or is what people are telling me true? And part of why women in gender studies connected with me so much is that for me, it is what we can see makes more sense to me. We know the impacts of racism are real. We know the impacts of sexism are real because we see them in real life. And so I wanted to point out this critical thinking piece and tie this here, in part for you all as you perhaps continue to study this subject, and we'll hear that criticism, but also just kind of know, where we stand as a field, which is we totally want people to think critically. We believe that critical thinking will lead you to certain conclusions because we see these things as true in the world because they're observable, versus asking you to not think critically or asking you to think partially critically. This is very much our wheelhouse and how we got to the understandings of the world that we currently have. So these next few quotes are from a Intro Women Gender Sexuality Studies textbook. I linked that here as well. Like our book, it is a free open source resource. So these authors say binary ways of thinking assume that there are only two categories of gender, race, and class identities, among others, and that these two categories are complete opposites. And that does tend to be how we think about social identities. And we're going to talk a bit about what you may have already gathered, which is, well, obviously there's more than two races. And we're going to talk about that, and how we still tend to think of this as a binary system in ways that are problematic in a few different ways. But they also posit that part of these binary systems is that typically one group is really well defined. This is often the group that is intended to experience oppression in this binary system. Binaries totally exist to create an oppressed group. Gender, as we know it today, exists to oppress women. Transphobia exists, sexism exists to oppress trans people. These binaries are not seemingly ever really created with the idea of equality or equity in mind. Part of the purpose of categorizing people in the first place is so that you can decide who to shit on, essentially. And so these authors essentially posit that in a lot of cases, if not all cases, we tend to define the group that will become marginalized. So we define what a gay person is, what a woman is, what a Black person is. And then the dominant group is often created by the lack of that identity. So that the identity of what is a woman, what do we expect of a woman, was very intentionally crafted, whereas what do we expect of men, maybe not as specifically crafted, because that wasn't as essential for the system to run. That we expect women to be caretakers, we expect women to be physically feminine, we expect them to be gentle, we expect them to be relatively quiet, to not take up a ton of space, to not be leaders. We give a lot more leeway to men, to be lots of different types of men. We don't think of somebody as like not a man in a lot of cases, even if they're not hyper masculine. And as soon as a woman defies a pure feminine aesthetic or role, her gender or her value tends to be questioned pretty immediately. So it says, just as men are defined as not women in a binary system, straight people are defined as not gay, white people are defined as not Black, and middle class and rich people are defined as not poor. The class example is really interesting. Is in deciding what to do on a future slide, I was deciding whether I should say rich people or middle class people. And this is a great example of where we can already start to see the breakdown of one of these binaries. But you can also argue too that that binary is talked about in a couple of different ways. So these authors go on to say, oppositional binary thinking works strategically such that the dominant groups in society are associated with more valued traits, while subordinate groups defined as their opposites are always associated with less valued traits. Thus, the poles in a binary system define each other. It only makes sense in the presence of their opposites. Masculinity only has a meaning as the opposite of femininity. In reality, identities and lives are complex and multifaceted. For one, all categories of identity are more richly expressed and understood as matrices of difference. More than that, all of us have multiple aspects of identity that we experience simultaneously and are mutually constitutive. So what this is saying is that part of why these binaries are constructed is, as I mentioned, to create these groups that experience oppression, that we assign negative value to, and that dominant groups are seen as, are often defined as being the people with the traits that are being deemed positive. And we, as people in privileged situations, essentially do everything we can to try to, like, quote unquote prove that people with these marginalized identities are negative in the ways that we claim them to be. So this is where you see a lot of negative racial stereotypes. This is where when you see men writing women in media, it's why you see them as the way that they often are. Why when men write stories about men, they are so often literal heroes. And that those terms don't really have meaning unless we define their opposites. A really interesting point on the who gets named and when and why story is, we'll talk about this in a couple of slides, is the identity of cisgender, so CIS gender. And that's the word for people who are not transgender. And I talk about this all the time in my job, in my other job, that we have to have a word for people who are not trans, or else people will say trans people and normal people. The word for trans came first, though. Like, we had a word for trans, we had a word for this group that was experiencing this particular type of oppression before we had a word for the dominant group. because we had to other trans people before we could um, move forward with the system and do anything else. And this acknowledges too that part of why these binary systems don't work in describing actual lived experiences is all of our intersecting identities. That a Black woman's experience with sexism is not going to be the same as a white woman's experience with sexism. That my experiences with transphobia and cis sexism are not going to be the same as a trans woman of color by any means. And so that you can't even say, this is the trans experience, this is the cis experience. Trans experiences are so varied. And there are tons of folks whose lived experiences fall in a place of debatability as to whether or not we might consider that a trans experience. People like my mom, who has really short hair and gets called sir in the grocery store all the time, but has never, to my knowledge, expressed any gender identity other than woman. There's overlap with her experience and with trans experiences of being misgendered without her being a trans person. Lots of butch people and femme people and ambiguous gendered people in their presentation have this experience that whether or not they identify as trans, their lived experience is not entirely a cis lived experience nor entirely a trans lived experience, because that binary in and of itself is something that we've created in an attempt to describe different types of lived experience. So these authors go on to say, our experience of gender is always shaped by our race, class, and other identities. Our experience of race is particular to our gender, class, and other identities as well. This is why taking an intersectional approach to understanding identity gives us a more complex understanding of social reality. Each of our social locations is impacted by the intersection of several facets of identity in a way that should give us pause when we encounter blanket statements like all men are blank, all Latinos are blank, all lesbians are blank. The social world is complex, and rather than reducing human difference to simple binaries, we must embrace the world as it is and acknowledge the complexity. So these are, when we talk about false social binaries, these are some of the things that we talk about. So we have to hear about there's gay people and straight people. Through my time in college, one of the main purposes of stuff like safe training, we do LGBTQ plus 101 information at OU. We talked a lot in the 2010s about bisexuality and pansexuality being real, and convincing people that those were real, that it was possible to be attracted to more than one gender. And when gay people experience oppression and straight people don't experience oppression on the basis of sexual orientation, bisexual people and pansexual people and otherwise queer people totally throw a wrench in that system. This is why when a bisexual woman is with a man, she's often referred to as straight, and when she's with a woman, is often referred to as gay, or that those are referred to as straight relationships or gay relationships. We are taught that we have to be able to categorize things in that way. That's either a straight or a gay relationship. That it is impossible for me to be uniquely a bisexual relationship if it's between one or two bisexual people, when that's actually the case. What's actually the case is that person's lived experience is of being attracted to more than one gender. And that often means that they are constantly experiencing oppression around sexual orientation in a lack of visibility and people not believing that their identity is possible or real, or that it's a phase. They may also experience certain types of oppression when they are in queer spaces, when people know that they're queer, when they're in queer relationships. And that experience may change when they are in straight relationships. That doesn't change their experience entirely. It does not make their experience the same as a straight person. They still have all the history and context of their prior experiences, and they're still dealing with that invisibility that often comes with those relationships as not being seen as queer because you're with somebody of a different gender and bi. Um, but we rarely talk about lived experiences in that much detail when that's more close to reality. Um, so black versus white. And so we are, of course, generally taught that there are more than two races. There are more than black people and white people. We are not really taught about how racism works outside of the context of those two groups. And this may be different, especially if you are someone who is a person of color and not black and also not a white person. Um, that lessons that you were given about yourself may change this a little bit. But in terms of how we are taught to understand racism, we're taught about um, civil rights movements led by Black people as if they were composed only of Black people. And we don't often hear about the experiences of racism faced by Arab, Middle Eastern, North African folks, of Asian people, uh, of Pacific Islanders and Indigenous Hawaiians, of Indigenous North Americans, of Latinx folks. And there's another binary in here that I find interesting, which is the binary of like people of color versus white people, which for a lot of individuals can get really tricky. We often, and you may not, I say we, I'm often in spaces where I hear Latinx folks talking about whether or not they are white. The answer is it depends. About Arab Middle Eastern folks talking about whether or not they're white. The answer is it depends. And part of that is when we talk about whiteness, we're in part talking about, do you have a white lived experience? Do you move through the world, people seeing you as white and being treated as such, or do you not? And for some people, that isn't the answer to that question isn't the same from situation to situation. My fiance is generally perceived as a not white person, but in high school was often perceived as white for some reason. She also isn't generally perceived as black, which she is. And she experiences racism, but not the exact racism that people might expect from her as a black person. She's also indigenous, and so there's an invisibility there. There's a disconnection from culture there. She's also ethnically Jewish. And that gets really tricky for people. If we're talking about race as there's a group that is privileged and a group that doesn't, there's debate about whether or not Jews should count as white. Irish people did not always count as white. Whiteness has shifted to include groups we want to consider white when we want to consider them white. There are certainly groups which we would say have conditional whiteness or who have attained whiteness in the US, but are still considered vastly different from other white people in other parts of the world. Another example of a binary we talk about within race, or a system that is less binary than we would think in when it comes to race, is we often hear about colorism, and that Black people who have lighter skin are awarded more privilege relative to Black people with darker skin. And this is true. And light-skinned Black folks also have a unique experience and experience a certain type of racism that is different from darker Black folks. That isn't not racism or less racism. It just is different. That lighter Black folks may take heat from Black communities and non-Black communities. That being asked what you are constantly is a microaggression. And that they may simultaneously come with some advantages, that experience of person who experiences colorism or benefits from colorism and one who doesn't isn't necessarily a clean, there's white people and dark people line. One in part because shades of human skin exist, but also because those experiences are really contextual. It depends so much on other identities, um, and just aren't easy to categorize in a binary. So another one is male and female. So we'll talk about this more in a bit. But this dichotomy is problematic in several ways. One is intersex people exist. So intersex folks are individuals whose biological sex is not ambiguously male nor female. That can be significant hormonal differences, that can be chromosomal differences. So we expect people to have either XX or XY sex chromosomes. Some people have variations on that. So when I have an X without a second sex gene, that's called XO. There's folks who are XXY, so they have an extra sex gene, and all sorts of variations there as well. I believe there's some folks who just have a Y, which adds some more complications in terms of the other genes you're not getting. Like there's some disability there, if I'm remembering correctly. And sex isn't necessarily binary in lots of other circumstances as well. And so, for example, I was assigned female at birth. I was born with a uterus and ovaries, with a vulva. In puberty, I developed what people would consider to be breasts. And as far as I know, I have XX chromosomes, right? My driver's license says male because my identity is man. That includes my insurance has me listed as male. And there's sometimes the option to I in theory have the option to be listed as female within my insurance provider. Neither of them really helps me. I no longer have ovaries, I no longer have a uterus, I no longer have a cervix, so I can't get pap smears, can't get pregnant, can't get ovarian cancer, can't get uterine cancer. I don't have breasts anymore, so can't get mammograms. If I go to a doctor and I put female as sex, I'm gonna get a lot of questions that are super irrelevant. And they might miss some stuff that is important. So my health risks in a lot of ways are what you would expect of males in my age group. And if I put male on that piece of paper, I'm going to get prostate questions and wipe the tip of your penis to get a clean urine sample directions, and that's not helpful either. And so we're going to talk about the idea of assigned sex at birth in a minute, which is binary. For the most part, it's the closest we have to a true binary. But that, for a lot of reasons, I consider myself somebody whose sex isn't necessarily ambiguous, like unambiguously female, in that my hormone levels are what we'd expect of males. I don't have a lot of the organs that we consider to make someone female. Doesn't necessarily make me male either. But that at what, as we were talking about in the beginning of with coffee lovers or whatever it is, where do we draw the line? If a person is assigned male at birth and loses their penis in an accident, is that person still male? Most people would say yes. And where does that line end? Another piece is that penises and clitorises are effectively the same organ. They get differentiated over time. So you see penises of various sizes, while you see clitorises of various sizes. And you can essentially line up penises to clitorises and make a bell curve. It wouldn't necessarily be bell-shaped, but kind of sort of be reverse bell-shaped in a way. Really more of a U shape in that most people have genitalia that can be easily distinguished as a penis or as a clitoris or a vulva. but clitorises range from what we would consider to be large to what we would consider to be incredibly small. So a clitoris that protrudes up to a few inches to one that is difficult to find. Penises can range from ones that flaccid are difficult to measure in amount of inches to several inches. And that is a non-binary sex situation. That we don't just have two bodies, two sexed bodies, that people live in lots of places in between. The stat is that about 1 in 100 people are intersex. A lot of people don't know it. A lot of people, a lot of times, it's not known information at birth. Often we find out in puberty, or people are trying to have kids, that their internal sex organs or hormones or chromosomes don't line up with what they thought that they had. But in lots of ways, sex being a binary starts to create some problems. Women and men. So for one, non-binary people exist, and the lived experience of men, women, and non-binary people often have significant overlap, right? That there are not necessarily really jobs that only men do or only women do, rather that mostly men do or that mostly women do. That non-binary people do all sorts of stuff. That the majority of our daily lives, the things that we would consider the like man stuff and woman stuff, very few people have lived experiences that are purely one of these things, right? Most men have liked something that we would consider feminine at some point. They have worn a color we would consider feminine at some point. Most women have traits we would consider more masculine. They have interests that are more masculine, as we would determine those. But with this binary in particular, so we're going to talk about the most today, this binary exists to oppress women, and the idea that everybody has to be a man or a woman exists so that we know who to oppress, essentially. Another false binary is the idea of liberal and conservative binary, and many people fall in between here. And this is a common issue we hear about, especially from young people who are not interested in being politically active, is they're like, I'm not either of these things. I agree with some of what this party is saying and some of what this party is saying. But that what politicians would lead us to believe is that there are two types of people in this country, good people and bad people. Depending on which party you're in determines which of those groups is seen as good and bad. And I thought it was interesting. There's often a dichotomy between people who are religious versus non-religious. That if folks are not religious in a particular way as somebody else, they're often seen as just completely non-religious. This is something we see in Judaism in particular. As a Reconstructionist Jew, Reconstructionism is not seen as a school of Judaism by most other schools of Judaism. And if you identify as such, to most Jews, you are generally then referred to as like, oh, you're not religious. That there's this kind of gatekeeperiness of needing to be religious in particular ways to be considered religious or spiritual. When we all know this lived experience is very different. There are people who feel compelled to go to church every week or to a temple every week, and there are people who don't. That doesn't make those people any less devout. An example of this that I find really interesting is my boss, one of my bosses is a Muslim man, and in Muslim texts, it is kind of expressed that there should be limits to physical contact between genders outside of certain relationships. And my partner came to work, as far as my boss knows, is a woman, was actually non-binary, and he just immediately reached out to shake her hand. And I was talking to her about him later, and she goes, "Oh, but he shook my hand." And she is a person who previously was Muslim. She understands these intricacies, um, but that to some folks, my boss choosing to engage in this particular social practice would mean like, "Oh, he's not religious. He must not be religious." Because he doesn't practice religion in the same way that I do. And so this one is interesting in that an example of binary thing we engage in, not necessarily a example of binary categories that we use or that we assume to be as true all the time as some of these other ones, but wanted to point that out as just another example of what we're talking about here in a slightly different way. I'm going to pause for just a minute here, and we'll be back momentarily. Okay, so before I share my screen again, one of the things that can be really challenging for folks in women gender studies and sociology and a lot of other social science subjects is that sometimes we are breaking down things that are been overly simplified without necessarily coming to, and here's the very clean reality of the situation. In part, usually because the nature of the thing is there isn't one, that it's totally complicated, that language isn't perfect yet, that we anticipate more things to evolve. And that is very much the case when it comes to explaining sex and gender. I don't necessarily think you're going to leave this feeling like, oh, I get it now. Because I don't think that's really possible. What I think is most important is breaking down the ideas that we come in with that are overly simplistic, having you understand how and why they're overly simplistic. And we kind of have to grow into being more comfortable with that kind of being the endpoint. That as we acknowledge the complexity of the real world, sometimes that means that language isn't there yet and that things get a little messy. And so things are going to get a little messy when we talk about sex and gender. And that's okay. That's part of what we're exploring here. That's part of why this is a conversation that we have. Just is the fact that, you know, the reality isn't black and white. And so neither is the way that we're going to talk about any of this. So we talk about sex. Some people say biological sex. I'll talk where explain through here why I tend to not use that word very often, biological sex. But sex refers to individual sex chromosomes, primary and secondary sex characteristics as and hormones. We use the words male, female, and intersex to describe sex. And as I mentioned, intersex people are folks who are not ambiguously male nor female from birth in at least one of these ways. So primary sex characteristics are genitalia. Secondary sex characteristics are things like body hair, breasts, and body shape. So as we talked about in a couple slides ago, this isn't binary. But the ways we are expected to identify and act are significantly more binary. And so in the US, and this has changed in some cases very recently, each person born in the US and most other countries must be classified as either male or female on their birth certificate, even if they are visibly intersex at birth or if there's doubt about their chromosomes. And this usually has to happen relatively quickly. So there's actually a tool, like a physical measurement tool that is used on infants who have ambiguous genitalia. If genitalia is under a certain size, they're given the female marker. Over a certain size, they're usually given the male marker. But this skews significantly towards most intersex folks being assigned female at birth, who are visibly intersex. And part of the idea behind that is the perspectives of men being really centered in this decision making, and men seeing having what they would consider an insufficient penis or testicles as just so utterly horrific. And something I've heard a lot as a trans man. I distinctly remember with being in line at the cafeteria in Vandenberg, and dudes talking about how if their dick got chopped off, life wouldn't be worth living, and how, just terrible it would be to be a dude who didn't have a dick. And that's like all I know. So it's just very interesting to me. Um, but the idea is essentially that that is such a horrific social experience that people are going to have a better life if they're assigned female at birth, and often given genital surgeries as infants to have their genitalia look more like what we expect of a female person. Many of these people grew up and do not identify as women, even more commonly than just like trans people existing in the world. Some of these folks will identify as trans, some won't. In the same way that this isn't binary. A lot of intersex people will have very trans lived experiences of being assigned female at birth, being raised with the expectation of being a woman, not identifying as such. That's a pretty trans experience. But if your definition of trans is that your gender and your sex don't match in a society expected way, then an intersex person who's not male nor female and isn't a man or a woman may not feel that transness really makes sense for them, and that term makes sense for them, and that's just an individual decision. But the gender marker, the sex marker that's put on your original birth certificate, male or female, does tend to dictate how we are raised. So the expectation of what our identity is going to be as a child and as an adult as it relates to gender, that is generally based on our assigned sex at birth. And we say assigned sex at birth even for folks who are not intersex, in part to not be exclusionary of intersex experiences, but also to say that we're making these judgments based on what is visible, and that is not always reality in terms of someone's biology. And that most people don't actually know what their chromosomes are, but that the sex that you were given on your original birth certificate does generally dictate so much of what your life is going to look like, what the expectations for you and your body and your gender are going to be. So everybody has an assigned sex at birth. For almost everybody, it is binary. It's either male or female. And so it's a permanent piece of information, right? The fact that my driver's license and birth certificate now say male doesn't change the fact that my assigned sex at birth is female. So it's one of the few examples in all of these conversations around identity where we do have essentially a binary categorization that is true and can be used. That does not mean that all assigned female at birth or assigned male at birth lived experiences are the same. But that with very, very, very few exceptions, most of those being people under the age of 5, at least in the US, this is a binary categorization that all of us have been involved in throughout our lives, whether it's come up as something we've thought about before or referred to or not. And it's gonna be really tempting, I think, especially like transphobic people. They're like, okay, cool. So we'll just use assigned sex at birth, talk about human beings, and clearly this is a binary because everybody's one of these two things. That lived experiences are going to be the same for all AFAB people and all AMAB people, AFAB assigned female at birth, AMAB assigned male at birth. And that part just isn't true by any means. So gender is an extremely hard thing to define. Most definitions you'll find of the word gender have the word gender in them. And that is because it is a thing that is so constructed. And we'll talk through this about why we have a different word for gender than the word for sex. But this is how I found the most helpful way to define gender is that most of us are taught there are two genders, men and women, and that everyone is one of those things. We're taught that children assigned female at birth will identify as women, and that children assigned male at birth will identify as men. We're taught that men should be masculine and women should be feminine, and to find any disturbances to that dichotomy wrong or bad. And I think is the best definition of what gender is this system where we expect people assigned female at birth to be women, and that we expect people assigned male at birth to be men, that not being unambiguously one of those two things we tend to see as bad or problematic to social systems, and that people are going to fit neatly into one of these two boxes. So how do we get here to having this word for gender that doesn't really have a clear definition? So conversations about sex differences predate conversations about gender roles. So talking about reproduction, talking about ways people notice that bodies and differences in bodies may be impacting people's behavior, that always existed. But placing men above non-men and enforcing certain roles and expectations is significantly newer, and that's what gender is. That's a huge part of what gender is. Humans have adapted their language over time to describe how we relate to that system. So to talk about somebody's maleness is to talk about their body. To talk about the way that somebody is a man is to talk about their comportment, which is how they show up in their body, is to talk about their behavior, is to talk about how they interact with other people. If we say somebody's not being man enough or they need to man up, we're saying they need to do something that's more masculine than what they're currently doing. They need to be tougher, they need to be stronger. We're not saying they need to have a bigger dick, right? We're not talking about sex. We're talking about gender. We're talking about these expectations for the humans in social roles. And in the 50s is when we kind of started to realize that we needed a different word to be talking about that expectations piece from the bodies piece. That the expectations we were holding people to were not the same across race. That people exhibited masculinity who were women or assigned female at birth. That people exhibited behaviors that were not specifically men's or women's. And we need ways to talk about those things and to be able to say what is for men and what is for women. And that's where all this language on gender comes from. Over time, it became clear we needed words to describe the system of categorization we developed and the roles that we assigned originally based on sex, as those roles were not inherent to those sexes, right? So the fact that we even talk about gender is an acknowledgement that, women doing all of the domestic labor is gender. People giving birth is about sex. But that who is doing the caretaking, what roles are we playing, how are we expected to act, that is gender. So this is really interesting to me because it shows an acknowledgement by this point, people were recognizing these weren't universal experiences, that even if this language stems from needing to talk about people who were violating gender norms, that we needed that language, that we knew language around sex wasn't going to be sufficient. Because gender is not binary. Individual experience is far more diverse than our existing binary system allows for. And the people have existed outside of these binaries that have been constructed over time. People existed and had diverse roles. Gendered expectations tend to shape those roles and discourage people from doing some things and encourage them to do others. That does not mean that it's the natural state of those people. The people have always existed outside of gender binaries. And part of how we know that is that in cultures that have been less impacted by colonization, particularly white Christian colonization, we tend to see less binary relationships to sex and gender. So countries like India, countries like Thailand, countries like just states and or groups such as Indigenous Native Americans, a lot of Africa and Latin America, that there are historical words for a third gender or fourth gender, or for people who exist in both masculine and feminine ways, that we sometimes see that language start to kind of die out as colonization occurs. But more often we see as folks being gendered in ways that we would consider to be not binary, that those are generally not seen as negative classifications in those societies. Colonization comes around, and then all of a sudden, those lived experiences that have already been happening all of a sudden become, quote unquote, a bad thing in that society. That those experiences are always there. My general perspective is that the more individual people break down how gender has impacted them, how gender works in the world, that we're just less likely to see ourselves in binaries. And so if you don't have a binary that's being enforced upon you, you're going to live just in your authentic self and in your life. And that's generally what happened prior to folks coming in and being like, no, you have to act in these particular ways. It just makes more sense looking at human experiences that human beings would have infinite personal unique relationships to the traits we associate with each gender. And so that is a big part of what your reflection for this week is about, is those masculine and feminine traits within yourself. And I want to pull that up really quickly, show you. I am going to catch up on grading this weekend, by the way. We got Moodle Forum 2. So I put a little note here that says, if you don't feel comfortable answering these questions on the forum, you can just email me your responses. I would much prefer folks engage with the forum so that folks can respond to you. But especially for trans and non-binary folks in this class, they're not exclusively, but that's who I have in mind with this rule. If you don't want to out yourself to the class, basically, just email me these answers instead. But please follow up with me to make sure that you get graded correctly if you do that. Just like me checking your grade book, come to me if I make a mistake. Much appreciated there. So your question for this week's Moodle Forum is, how do you describe your own gender? How and when do you come to this understanding? For your answers, I've always known or never questioned it. How do you know what your gender is? When did you first learn about trans non-binary people? How did you learn about us? What questions do you have about trans non-binary people after completing this week's readings and videos? And that is in there because I will come in and answer those questions for you all. But putting them in the forum was intentional so that other people can see your questions as well as my answers to them. But yeah, so think about I'm going to say 3 different people in your life who all have the same gender identity. So I'm thinking of like me, my brother, and my dad. So me, my brother, and my dad have a lot in common. We have similar ethnic backgrounds in that my brother and I are genetically 50% basically my father. 2 of us are cis, 1 of us is trans. That part is different. We're all white. There's a lot of overlap in our lived experiences as 3 white dudes. And our genders are very different from each other, right? So I generally get read as like a cis gay dude. Like I am usually seen as like relatively feminine compared to my brother and my dad. Which is really interesting if you think about a lot of misconceptions around trans people is that we are all pretty hyper our gender, and that's just like couldn't be farther from the truth. We just think about it a lot more, talk about it a lot more because we're getting misgendered or we're getting mistreated or we're having to explain ourselves or defend ourselves. Um, the folks' genders are super diverse, cis people and trans people. My brother is 6'5", is 350 pounds, and is the gentlest human person that you could ever meet. I'm not a contact sports person. I am way more a contact sports person than my brother is. Um, he also isn't particularly feminine either. But his style of masculinity isn't rooted in sports. I truly think it's because my brother has never recreationally watched a sport, um, literally ever since childhood. He's a band nerd. Um, and he's a professional musician and he teaches music. So he's kind of got that like rocker thing, but he's not super rocker person. Um, his masculinity looks really different from, using a super extreme example, like The Rock, like Dwayne The Rock Johnson, who is also a very large person and also a very gentle person. Um, but they just have totally different vibes. Rock's still all about like the fitness piece and the strength piece, and Charlie's just big. Um, and then you have my dad, who isn't hyper masculine in that he's not um, super aggressive. He's not a super angry person, um, but he hunts and fishes and um, works on cars and does woodwork. Um, and like sports kind of, but is really more into comedy. Um, our relationships to masculinity are all very different. Um, the ways we grew up were very different, but that we all have the same gender identity, but our gender expressions and our genders are different. Um, and those are people who have a million reasons to be as similar as humanly possible. But the way our gender shows up in the world isn't identical, me, my dad, and my brother. Um, you think about that as every person in the world, yeah, it doesn't make sense that everybody would fit into two boxes. It doesn't make sense that we would think about things in such concrete and binary ways. Um, one thing is we look at the people in our lives, we can all start to see ways in which, even amongst cisgender people, um, gender is not one concrete thing. Um, and that people do have unique personal relationships with gender. Um, I think the difference between a lot of non-binary people and trans people and cis people is, have they given themselves permission to think critically about gender, um, what that's meant for them, um, and how they see themselves in the world. I think, um, when you see people coming out later in life, a lot of times it's that they've known the whole time and they've just chosen not to say anything. A lot of times is that they've started thinking about stuff later in life, that something sparks something and they realize like, oh, this is what's been happening with me. That's certainly the case for me. Um, I think a lot of the discomfort that people face could be explained by social discomfort people face can often be explained by like, I'm being asked to perform gender in a particular way that I'm not comfortable with. Um, there's an example. An example I just thought of was I was at I was when I worked at Eastern, I was at one of those like student org fair things, and I was representing the department that I worked for. And this guy, this like parent dad, came up to me, which is like, "Oh hey, like, do you know the scores of whatever football game?" I was like, "No, I didn't even know there was a game." I think he said like, "Oh, the game's not on in here," something like that. I'm like, like what game? I don't know. Um, that's just a game of like we had the same gender, our gender is not the same, right? Gender identity is the sense that one has of being a man, woman, non-binary, something else, neither, both, all the above, etc. But where we feel most comfortable labeling ourselves within that system. It's generally not something that people choose. It is something that they feel, know, or learn about themselves in time. The options we see for ourselves are informed by our culture. We find the terminology that is available to describe our experience the best we can. So I think this is really important. We hear a lot that that there's kind of like a wave of people being non-binary, that it's a trend, that it's new, that it must not be real. It's a thing that people are just deciding to be all of a sudden. That's not what's happening. What's happening is lots of people have had this lived experience. They didn't have access to each other. They didn't have access to community. This is really taboo to talk about, that folks had this lived experience of feeling like they were not a man, feeling like they weren't a woman, often expressing that in art, right? Prince saying, I'm not a woman, I'm not a man, I'm something you'll never understand. I don't believe in assigning people identities who didn't say them for themselves, but that's non-binary shit. Like that is what non-binary people say. And David Bowie had similar stuff going on. When I was coming up in queer community, we didn't use the word non-binary a lot. We used the word genderqueer and agender and gender fluid as people's primary identity terms, which were all, we could say, ways of being non-binary, but very few people I knew were just using the term non-binary to describe their experience. Now, most of those people in my life are using the word non-binary as the primary identifier, because people know what it means now. So they can say I'm non-binary and people will understand, oh, that means this person's not a woman and not a man. I should probably ask them about their pronouns. Versus saying a word and having everyone be like, what is that? Every single time. That people hear other people expressing just any piece of this that that they felt they didn't fit into the system, and that can unlock things in people's minds of it's not giving people the idea and making them trans or non-binary, but rather taking a struggle that they've had their entire lives and finally contextualizing it in a way that makes that experience make sense for them. If that is paired with community, whether that's in person or online, people are going to use the same language. The more people using the same language, the more of a community that you have, a visible community that you have. If you talk to older people, few of them are going to identify as non-binary, but many of them will articulate an experience that you're like, that's what all my non-binary friends say. They may have put that in a butch box, they may put that in a femme box, they may put that in a binary trans person box, or a male to female box, female to male box. They might just think it's part of their queerness. That's all valid. And if they were in a more modern context, I think that their relationship to those parts themselves might be different. And so that's really, I think, what's happening here when we say like options we see for ourselves are informed by our culture. Is now that we can put ideas in people's minds and make them into those things, is that if we provide people with language that describes the things they're already experiencing, they're going to use that language. And if that language is more universal, it's going to be and seem like a larger group of people who are all saying the same thing because they've just found each other and are describing it the same. So this is why language is always in flux, because it needs to be. A newer word does not mean a newer experience, just that language has caught up. So gender expression refers to how we present ourselves to the world in ways that our society sees as gendered. This is typically how we communicate our gender to other people. Caveat there is that sometimes people aren't able to authentically express their gender. Fear of violence, fear of being outed, family situations, all of that. Gender expression, the choices we make around how we're presenting our gender to other people, it's more important to some people than others, but it's probably more important to you than you think. If you are, and this is particularly tricky when we talk about people who are assigned female at birth, in that we are given permission to dabble in masculinity a lot more than assigned male at birth people are given permission to dabble in femininity. So what I mean by that is all of the assigned female at birth people in this class, we probably all own a t-shirt and jeans. We might own a t-shirt that we've owned since we were younger. Um, and we can put those things on, and we could put our hair in a hat, and we could be a tomboy, and have that be a word people used, and not necessarily be seen as a good thing. We're still being seen as somebody who is transgressing in gender, but we have words for that. We have the word tomboy. We often do give women pseudo permission to adopt masculinity in ways we'll talk about throughout this semester. Whereas if you are an assigned male at birth person and you cross into femininity at all, it is seen as hugely transgressive. It is seen as a very declarative statement about like, oh, you are trans, like you are a woman. If you wear a skirt once, or you are not a man anymore if you paint your nails once. But anyway, so this is more important to people than others. And I also find that the less the way you express your gender impacts how you feel, the more likely you probably just are non-binary. But if you are a person who generally wears more feminine stuff, imagine or try, if you want to, going a week wearing all stuff that you consider really masculine. See how it feels. If you're like my mom and you got called sir at the store, would it bother you? If those things are true, like if it would bother you to be misgendered in a store, that is because like you actually have a gender that you care about and is important to you. You just likely haven't had to think about it as much as trans people have. Something I was talking about with me, my dad, and my brother, I kind of call it like the flavor of our gender identity. So this is another part of gender expression. As a gender expression is a choice. So I make choices every day to put on certain clothes. I make choices around hair. I make choices around hormones and surgery. But it's not a fully free, it doesn't feel to me like a fully free choice, right? That I could put on a dress, that will cause me intense psychological harm. I will feel like I am not dressing like my gender if I wear a dress or a skirt. So I say that gender expression is a choice, one that's informed by the ways that we feel comfortable being seen. And so that's really what our gender expression is the which things feel like us, which things don't. This is what I call like the gender expression comfort zone. And there are things that would make them feel like they're no longer expressing their gender. So people using she, her pronouns with me, it no longer feels like my gender. Me wearing makeup in like a more feminine way doesn't feel like me expressing my gender anymore. We each have our own kind of individual lines here, and that's exactly the point, is that this isn't binary. I didn't say all makeup. There's like dude rock eyeliner. I paint my nails occasionally. Those things don't make me necessarily feel like I'm not projecting my gender, but wearing like a full face would. So we do this with nails. This should be on here. Nails, names, hair, clothes, body modifications, including surgery, body postures, and beyond. Ignore my little subtitle here where I forgot to type something. We're going to talk about trans non-binary people, and we're going to take one more quick break. Okay, so we're going to talk about trans and non-binary people in this section here. This is definitely the area that I do the most education in, and so please don't hesitate to ask me any questions you have here. I've got millions of resources for you, including as we're talking about stuff, you starting to have some realizations about yourself. It is quite literally my job to help you through that. As part of why I love that I teach this and have the job that I have is any exploration around yourself that this leads you to. I'm able to support you very formally in my capacity as GSC coordinator through that as well. So the term transgender is an umbrella term available to individuals whose gender identity does not conform to societal expectations based on their assigned sex at birth. I've also before seen this say gender identity or expression. And that this is very broad. And so people, especially when it says gender identity and expression doesn't conform to societal norms, they're like, well, then all butch people would be trans. All, feminine gay dudes be trans. To which I say, if people use words that help them describe their lived experiences. So we, as a trans community, have really resisted more exclusionary definitions of transness. We've often heard transness defined primarily for binary folks like myself, trans men and trans women. We'll hear definitions that are like someone whose gender is opposite what was assigned at birth, and that's not the reality of trans experiences. And folks whose gender identity is not what we would have expected. So people assigned female at birth who do not grow up to identify as women or entirely as women, and assigned male at birth folks who do not grow up to identify as men or entirely as men, and some intersex folks as well, just personal preference thing. If they feel like saying they're trans helps describe their lived experience in this particular way of being assigned something at birth and then their gender being different from what was expected, that turns available to them as well. That does that mean that everyone finds this term useful who falls into that umbrella? If you say I'm trans to people, they assume that means like if you're assigned male at birth, that means that you don't identify as a woman. It tends to imply to people that you don't want them to use she, her pronouns, so some clarification is needed. And that your gender is like not woman or not entirely woman. And then say much about what your gender is, and that's on purpose. But that if in talking about your gender, there's some sort of social or medical transition involved of people seeing you one way and then you needing them to see you a different way, that's usually a good sign of the word trans being a good fit for you. People who use the term trans and don't find it useful, so say some butch people, when I say I'm trans, they'll be like, oh, so you're going to, what pronouns are going to use? They say she, her. That keeps happening. They're probably not going to use the word trans anymore. Like it's not helping them describe their experience. So this definition being more broad isn't really a problem for us. People aren't like signing up to be trans. It like very much sucks to be trans in this world. But it's broad on purpose because of the diversity of trans experiences. Hopefully that makes sense. Non-binary is an umbrella term available to individuals whose gender identity is not man nor woman or not entirely one of those things. So some trans people do identify as men and women. We have trans men, trans women, and a lot of folks don't. We'll talk about trans non-binary folks calling themselves trans in just a moment. And then as we've talked about before, cisgender is the term for individuals who are not trans or non-binary. So congratulations on your new identity if you just found out that that's you. It's non-binary. Many people, non-binary people specifically use the word non-binary to talk about their gender identity. You may also hear words like genderqueer, gender fluid, agender, and bigender. And what's important for you to know is not specific definitions for these terms because they vary so much person to person, but rather just that they are kind of ways of being non-binary. The trick here is that the word gender is in them. And this is a big part of why we say transgender, not transsexual anymore, is that now all of the gender related words say gender. and all the sexuality related words say sexual. And there's always an exception to this, like the word lesbian doesn't have the word sexual in it, but like homosexual does. Bisexual, pansexual, etc. So all the gender words have gender in them. All the sexuality words, for the most part, have sex or sexual in them. Totally okay to ask folks to define these terms. I find a great way to do that is to be like, oh, hey, I know that that's a non-binary identity and that people define differently. How do you define that, or what do you want me to know about you so that I can be as respectful as possible? Feel free to say you got it from me in this class. If people are like, why are you asking me that? You're like, oh, my professor told me I was to ask, never mind. Non-binary people can and do express their genders in unique ways and are not always androgynous. So this is where I talk about identity not always equaling expression, and that we kind of have a gender comfort zone, and that for a lot of us, we may express ourselves in ways that are sometimes seen as really feminine, and sometimes as kind of feminine, and sometimes as more neutral. And not many people have that same scope of expression too. What they also have is the identity piece is not man or woman. So they may communicate that in various ways. They're going to have their own gender expression comfort zone. That's not necessarily going to be what we would consider to be androgynous. Some non-binary people also identify as trans, others don't. And for me, that tends to come down to, is saying I'm trans helpful when they're communicating with others in terms of what their lived experience has been like. So my partner and I are examples of this. So I don't identify as non-binary. I could, in theory, with ways that I think about my own gender, but it's just never really sat right with me. There are lots of folks who have very similar experiences to me in terms of transition, who identify as non-binary and also identify as trans. My partner is non-binary, has uses she or they pronouns, assigned female at birth. Feels like she's not necessarily entirely a woman, but isn't offended by she her pronouns, has no interest in any kind of like medical transition really, doesn't mind being perceived as a woman, just also knows that that's necessarily the whole story. Feels kind of like woman adjacent is a thing that I've heard her say before. So she does not identify as trans. She identifies as non-binary, but does identify as trans. Because in saying she's trans, people are going to make a lot of assumptions about what else that might mean for her, that she's going to be transitioning, that she's not going to be comfortable with she, her pronouns. And none of those things are true. So she doesn't find it helpful to say that she's trans, even when she finds it helpful to say she's non-binary. Whereas for my friend Laurent, who is non-binary, and uses they, them pronouns exclusively, they identify as trans, in that they need people to not use she, her pronouns. They needed access to translated medical care. Those both have to be true, kind of either or. But it's very much a personal decision. It depends on, as people try using out language, what works and what doesn't work, how they feel comfortable. It just totally depends on individual experience in relations to gender. So even like binary versus non-binary isn't really a binary, ironically. And we've talked about this already, that being non-binary isn't new. It's a common misunderstanding. The word is relatively new, the experience isn't. And that as we continue to deconstruct the ways that gender harms us and more descriptive language becomes available, people feel more empowered to express this as an identity rather than just an experience. I think we historically heard a lot of people talking about feeling othered in their gender, feeling like they weren't solely a man or solely a woman, that they were not like other men or not like other women. That a woman or not a man, something you never understand. People have like a boy aunt or like their girl uncle. People like, do they have either sometimes people saying like, oh, there's also like a female spirit that lives inside of me. This has been expressed forever, just depending on context of gender systems and with access to the internet and more universal language, we see it described differently, but that experience has very much always been there. So this is the part that I think is really important, is when I'm doing these slides as part of a training, I like to point this out in that we will often teach about trans people, and particularly like binary trans people, trans men and trans women, and then we'll teach about non-binary people as if they are a small part of the trans community, when that just isn't the case. So most trans people are non-binary. And so non-binary identity isn't like an advanced knowledge piece or something that you can understand binary trans people and then you can understand non-binary people. It just doesn't work like that. My theory on this is basically the more trans people have to think about our gender a lot just to understand ourselves, to advocate for ourselves, to get access to the care we need, all of this, to find community, all this stuff. As do queer people. And I think the more we explore that in ourselves, the less likely we are to come to really any binary conclusions, especially as non-binary options are presented to us as valid options. So rather than being like, I feel this thing that is obviously very unique to me. See, I feel this thing, and look, lots of other people feel this thing. But that the more we break down what gender means to us, what it looks like in society, what box we do and don't fit in, the more likely we are to just find places where we don't fit into a more binary box. So trans people who are thinking about their gender a lot are less likely to come to the realization that they are on one end, are in a binary identity at the end of that exploration. I think the same thing is true with people who explore sexual orientation. And while we see significantly more people identifying as bi than we do lesbian and gay, that as long as the stigma is not so much that you feel like it is impossible for you to truly be not in a binary, I think just a large amount of people don't fit into binaries. So people who are actively thinking about that are just less likely to find themselves in those binary categories. My understanding of it from watching it happen over time. Okay, so this class is about teaching you what exists. It is not necessarily generally going to a place where we're talking a ton about stuff like this, of how to be affirming to people. But I thought it's really important in part so that we can be affirming to folks who may be in this class, but also we've gotten to this point in teaching you, so I might as well kind of give you some of these tips that are here around being affirming as well, just because folks usually haven't gotten this kind of education. So use the name and pronouns people ask you to use. Ask follow-up questions if you need to ensure that you aren't outing them by using their name. So an example of this is, I was very out at school, but wasn't out at home. So I had to tell my friends, like, hey, if you see me walking around with people who look like be my parents, please don't like use my name. Working with students, occasionally there's situations where we have to engage with parents and make sure we're not outing them to their parents. I went to therapy really early on in my realization that I was trans, and they sent something home that had like my preferred name on it on the inside. That almost outed me. Sometimes follow-up questions, especially if people are newly out, can be helpful. We'll talk about pronouns more in a sec. If you mess up some of their pronouns, don't make a big deal. What I mean by that is when someone else, like call me she, and they'll be like, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I know better. I can't believe I did that. And then they kind of make it about themselves in the moment. Not helpful, makes people really anxious. Quickly correct yourself in the moment if you notice it. If not, just correct yourself in the next sentence. Apologize privately, go home and practice. The next slide is going to be about the barriers trans and non-binary people face in many aspects of life. And we're going to go through this with the different systems we talk about throughout the semester. This is the time in the semester it makes most sense to talk about this stuff for trans people. We'll talk about it for queer people, for low SES people, for Black and brown people, all these ways throughout the semester. Disabled people, non-disabled people, all that. But acknowledging those barriers and advocating for them to be removed. And then I put that the most effective way to learn about us is to be in community with us. But in order to be in community with us without causing us harm, we need you to be well-versed in these first 3 steps. So these are just some of the barriers faced by trans people in just like regular daily life, things that you don't necessarily think about. And I'm going to pause, stop talking for a second, and give you some time to just look over this. And if you need to pause the recording to keep looking, go ahead and do that now. So I want to talk about some of these barriers. And I think I'll provide some examples of the ways that these systems of oppression show up in daily life. And you may notice, especially if you have another marginalized identity, that some of these may also be true for you if you aren't trans, just because of a different identity. So for example, police being more likely to see us as deviant and that they're rarely knowledgeable about us. Police being more likely to see us as deviant is something that any Black person in this country could say, any Latinx person in this country can say, that a lot of disabled people can say. The really knowledgeable, certainly true for disabled people. These aren't necessarily exclusive to trans experience, but that these are aspects of trans experience and part of what we mean when we say that trans people are oppressed because we are trans. And that gets really tricky in that I am oppressed because I am trans. I am also privileged in that I'm a man. Whereas trans women and non-binary people are experiencing oppression based on gender and based on the transness of their gender simultaneously. I had the experience of gaining privilege in some ways and losing privilege in another. So this list really comes from, in part, things that still impact me, in that, you know, I walk through the world as a white dude, and that comes with a lot of privileges. I've watched myself be taken more seriously, be listened to more, be given more space to talk, being seen as an authority, being seen as physically threatening rather than as somebody who could be harmed. You know, my masculinity not being seen as something that makes me weird, but something that is supposed to make me more normal. My femininity no longer being seen as something that is supposed to make me normal and being seen something that makes me different. But that I also experience all of this, most of this stuff. There's a couple that I've been able to escape, and my privileges have helped me to do that in a lot of ways. So I focus on a few of these. So one I want to point out is the TSA. So this is an example of oppression that is not necessarily intentional. It's a result of systems being created by cis people without trans people in mind. And so that marginalization piece of oppression, that being cast aside and forgotten about piece of oppression from Fry's article, they just like didn't think about trans people existing when they made these machines. And that is very evident because every trans person I know has a problem in these machines. almost every single one. When I go through a body scanner, every single time, my right thigh and left ankle light up. I don't know why the ankle, that does not make any sense to me. Nothing's ever happened to that ankle. I don't get it. But right thigh, and it's a very high on my thigh dot, and they refer to that, this is direct quote what they have said to me, as a groin anomaly. So every time I go through the body scanner, they detect a groin anomaly, and I get pulled aside for a groin pat down. Every single time I go through the body scanner, those are the words they use, is groin anomaly. I have a friend who is non-binary who, when they wear a bra, will often set off the body scanner because they get read as male. They place the male button on the body scanner. That specifically makes sure if there's any metal in your chest area, that gets flagged. They mark you as female. It doesn't detect an underwear in a bra. But it's also looking for your body parts. And when it doesn't find them, it freaks out. And that is just a real thing that happens. Another one I would point out is some stuff with insurance. So a lot of insurance providers don't cover hormones or don't cover surgery. And that is often described as that those things are elective. They are not, in that for most of us who want them, they are very much essential in keeping us sane. And people not having access to them leads to a lot of turmoil for long periods of time. Most people have to pay for some part of that process out of pocket. 95+% of people are paying for surgery out of pocket. And that even if we do quote unquote like everything right, if we're taking to a binary system, I changed my gender marker from female to male, I've had surgeries, that can still result in us losing some of the healthcare that we need. So I have a friend who had genital reconstruction surgery. She transitioned from male to female, and she had general surgery at 18. And when they were in there, they found testicular cancer. She was already legally female, and so her insurance denied all of the cancer coverage because it was testicular cancer, and they had to fight insurance the whole time. Trans men who haven't had hysterectomies, who choose to get pregnant, or who are become pregnant not by their own choice, who need pap smears for accessing abortions. A lot of times these things can just be not covered anymore once we change our gender marker. And a lot of this is just like part of the oppression of this is like things cis people don't have to think about, or don't have to deal with that trans people do. Things that make our lives harder, that could be fixed, or that just are designed for cis people. Spaces. So I've never gotten naked in a public locker room in my life. I can't get naked in a men's locker room. I don't have a dick. Like, it's not safe. And I'm not welcoming women's locker rooms, which is fine. But I don't have a place that I'm supposed to be. In religions that separate individuals by sex or by gender, usually by gender, people are usually making visual assumptions, but not very people just like don't have space. I've heard religions respond to this by saying, oh, go with your assigned sex at birth, but then if somebody transitions in a more binary way, then that guidance changes. If that person's identity is seen at all, right? The entire sporting system is made for cis people. When we try to access it, we're often told, like, make your own thing. And we all know that separate but equal is never equal. Legislation. This is true for lots of communities. This is true for all people with uteruses, especially right now. Legislation that we're constantly at risk of losing rights due to anti-trans legislation, even in quote unquote blue states. People who have uteruses are constantly at risk of losing reproductive health rights. People who are who have disabilities are constantly at the whim of the government in changing disability benefits, in changing laws and what accommodations that they have to provide for folks. Um, the idea of this is what is available to me now, it may not be available in the future, is something that a lot of folks just kind of can't relate to. I think a lot of white women in particular felt like Roe was safe, that they're not. I was just talking with my partner yesterday that, trans people could have told y'all this shit comes and goes. That we gain rights, we lose rights. In just my adult lifetime, I've gone from being able to serve in the military to not, to able to not to able to again. In the last 10 years, basically. Not that I want to, but that for trans people, these rights are kind of constantly up in the air, even in quote unquote blue states, including in Michigan. It was still legal to be discriminated against for being in housing, in employment, for being trans in Michigan until very recently in the last 5 years. Burden of education piece is true for lots of groups, but constantly expected to teach cis people stuff. But cis people aren't expected to know anything or to even really listen to us when we do teach them. The expectation is basically we teach them every time. That whenever we just say something about transness or about ourselves, that should always come with like educational context, that we can't expect cis people to retain any of that information, that it can't be seen as important enough for them to just learn. Prisons and jails. So if I were to go to jail or to prison, all my shit says male, I'm going to the men's side. I'm not safe there. Same reason as locker rooms. I'm not safe there. Wouldn't necessarily make sense to me with the women, in terms of like being not invalidating people's identities. I would be safer there. I had to think about that stuff when I was deciding whether or not to change my gender marker. I get pulled over, I'm going to the men's prison. Or if I not pull over, if I get arrested, I'm going to the men's prison. Is that minute possibility of a thing that will probably never happen? Is that worth having a document that doesn't match my identity in all the other aspects of my life? And for me, it was worth it to change, but it's a constant fear that I have. The system knows this about us, that we're not necessarily safe in Gen Pop, and so they just put us in solitary, which is extremely cruel. But a lot of trans people are just in permanent solitary confinement, which is obviously not fair treatment. Harassment is constant, especially online, especially for trans women, but even for me. I did a kind of accidental experiment where I posted a video that was about trans stuff on my own TikTok. I didn't use any tags, put it on the GSD's TikTok, which has less followers, and I used like the trans tag. I got like all this hate in the comments. My personal favorite though is when people try to hate on me and there's like, you're never gonna be a woman. And I'm like, I fucking know. Because they think they can always tell, but they can't. It's very funny to me. There's a lot of stuff here. This is stuff I come up with in like 10 minutes. Like there's way more to it. Trans people are often turned away from services such as domestic violence or homelessness shelters, especially trans women. It is extremely difficult to find therapists that are knowledgeable about trans people. We're often paying to be in therapy to teach them stuff, let alone one who's prepared to provide documentations you need for your medical transition. There's tons of gatekeeping around medical transition. Any cis person. So I think that most plastic surgery is gender affirming surgery. I think every boob job is gender affirming surgery, even when it's for cis people. Because that's what it is. Like it is them looking more like what they want to look like in a very gendered way. Like that is gender related surgery. Cis people can get as much of that as they want. That was going to be covered by insurance, but nobody's telling them like you can or can't do this most of the time. Trans people have to get multiple letters from different clinicians just to get surgery that everyone's on the same page that we definitely need to feel like our authentic selves. We don't do that for cis people who want to make drastic changes to their body. We only do that for trans people. So with pronouns, so most people have strong feelings about the pronouns that are used in place of their name, even if they've never thought about it. So a lot of times people say like, I don't use pronouns, I don't care about pronouns. I'm like, you literally do. And you can test that by someone said they don't care about pronouns using other pronouns of the ones that they probably use. And watching them be uncomfortable. It's like, yeah, no, like you have pronouns that you use. It's usually dudes. It's like, no, yeah, like you're squirming because we're all calling you she. You care about what pronouns are used for you. You just don't want to use trans people's pronouns. You care when it's you most of the time. There are totally folks who don't care what pronouns used for them. That's valid too. Um, most of the people are being obstinate about it. They actually do. It's just they've just never experienced having someone use the wrong pronouns for them. Um, you may see folks indicate that they use multiple pronouns. So I talked about my partner using she, they. Um, it usually means you can use any of the pronouns they mention. I just try to ask people if they have a preference for what I use. Um, because sometimes people listing stuff because there's pronouns they know they're comfortable with and one they're testing out. Sometimes they're listing them in order of preference. Um, oftentimes people are listing one they think people will use and the one they actually want people to use. So I usually ask people if they have a preference. If they say no, I'll usually use the first thing that's listed. Because people are sometimes putting them in order of preference. I say more often than not, people are putting them in order of preference. But I've also seen like the one people use slash the one I actually want people to use. But I usually ask people if they have preference what I use. Some people want you to alternate. That's cool too. But generally speaking, if people list multiple pronoun options, you can just use any of those. So using singular they, them is not only grammatically correct and necessary for respecting individuals who use those pronouns, but it's also significantly easier than you think. So we do this all the time when we don't know people's gender. So we often people say like, they is only plural. Like it's literally not. If we were in, so say I go to a staff meeting and we all get up and leave and I notice that there's a coffee mug sitting on the table. I would go to my boss and be like, hey, someone left their mug. I probably wouldn't say someone left her mug, someone left his mug, even though in this particular case, me and my boss are the only men. So I could probably, someone left her mug, but nobody would say that. We would say someone left their mug, right? Even if I know everybody who could have possibly left it is a woman, right? Somebody left their mug. Or I'm trying to find a new dentist and I really hope I need their office to be close to my house, or I really need them to be, I really want them to be queer, or I need a new therapist and I hope that they are competent in trans stuff. We do it all the time. And so if you can just do that as you would on accident, when you don't know someone's gender, or when we're talking about people more ambiguously, we often use singular they. You can do it on purpose. So same thing, someone left their coffee cup. Hey, are they coming back soon? All of that accidental singular they that we use all the time, do that with intention. That's using they, them for someone. And this website can be helpful for they, them pronouns, but also for all these other pronouns that are in here. There's a couple versions of this website if you search like pronoun practice. So this is one where, so let's practice here. So it shows you how to use this pronoun. So I'm gonna do here, that's correct. I'm gonna do this one wrong on purpose. And it tells me it's wrong until I get it right. Here's not mine. I don't know what that was supposed to be. I don't understand the context of that sentence. But you can practice. So I think it's especially helpful for folks who use a pronoun that we haven't talked about. What I have found that is most folks in my circles and in OU are using they, them pronouns if they're using neutrals, mostly because people will use them relative to what we call neopronouns, so pronouns that are not existing English words. And it's super important to respect folks' pronouns, even if they are using neopronouns, and that we have to learn them. What I usually suggest is asking people how to spell them. They're like, oh, I use the, her pronouns. They're like, cool. Can you spell that for me so that I can go home and practice? And then you can go home and Google it, put it in a site like this, etc. This is our last couple of slides in terms of this kind of some reminders in terms of learning more. Um, when somebody tells you something you don't understand it, Googling is usually a great way versus making people educate you constantly. Talking to me is always great. Reading memoirs, so reading about people's lived experiences, reading stuff um, like general nonfiction. So we've got tons of books in the GSC about like what it means to be non-binary, how to use they them pronouns, Black queer experiences, got LGBT history stuff. We got fiction. We got all sorts of stuff. Reading, learning from their perspectives. Movies and films, same thing. We also have some guides in here um, for movies, TVs, documentaries that we recommend. Volunteering with the community, really helpful. I mentioned the best way to get to know us is to be in community with us. A great way to do that is to give us your time, give us your service, versus just like being there, soaking everything in. Like have it be a mutually beneficial relationship. We'll teach you stuff either directly or via being around us. You come help us out in return. Attending events and workshops. So it's all sorts of stuff that we put on as the GSC. A huge one I think is just following more LGBTQ plus, but especially in this context, trans people and non-binary people on social media, but with mindfulness to that being trans non-binary people of color, trans non-binary people with disabilities, trans non-binary immigrants, people with varying body types, trans non-binary people of various faith traditions, and of various sexualities. As well, we didn't really talk about trans people and sexuality, but our sexualities are essentially as diverse as cis people's, though we tend to skew queerer for that same reason of the longer we look at stuff, the less likely we are to fall into binaries. So most trans people identify as queer, bi, and pan, with a minority identifying as gay and an extremely small minority identifying as straight. And part of that is it's kind of hard to identify as straight if you're non-binary, because I guess the like in theory doesn't exist. Like if you're attracted to the same gender, like to other non-binary people, that's still considered gay. If you're attracted to any other gender, that's still considered queer. So that's part of it. Is like if most trans people are non-binary and almost no non-binary people identify as straight, then like you're not gonna have a lot of straight trans people. But even binary trans folks, like we just tend to not have super binary labels around sexual orientation either. And then this is my whole job, is running the Gender Sexuality Center. So it's the LGBTQ plus resource center for campus, offering programs and services which aim to support the retention and graduation of LGBTQ plus students, and works to make the campus community inclusive of all sexual orientations and gender identities. So what we mean by that is we have programs that specifically support LGBTQ plus students, staff, and faculty, and provide education for everyone else to be in better allyship with us, in part because in our community or out of our community isn't really a binary either. That a lot of folks who are engaging with us in learning are drawn to do so because they are not straight cis and they don't even have awareness of that yet. But that they're feeling some of the dissonance of conforming to that system. And so they try to learn more about it. And then they realize, oh, that's because I'm one of these things. We also know that people engage with LGBTQ plus communities for lots of reasons. Sometimes there's straight cis people here who are not here to just here to learn how to better support us, but also here to learn how to unpack some of the messaging they're getting around gender or around sex. I had a conversation with someone over the summer with a guy who identified as straight and cis, but had particular like fetishes and kinks that he's kind of needed somebody to say like, oh, that's a thing. And it doesn't make them part of the LGBTQ plus community, but it his experience of my sexuality doesn't feel normal still made us a good place for him to come and to receive support.